Hidden in the woods just north of Stillwater, Minnesota, there is a quiet stretch of riverbank with a cave in the bluff and almost nothing else to see. But for 58 years, this exact spot was one of the busiest industrial sites in the entire American Northwest. Millions upon millions of pine logs funneled through this bend in the St. Croix River, and at times the logs jammed the water solid for 9 miles upstream. Today the machinery is gone, the crews are gone, and the forest has closed back in. We are going to walk this shoreline, step inside that sandstone cave, and uncover the story of the great St. Croix log boom. The St. Croix River rises in northern Wisconsin and runs about 160 miles south, forming the border between Wisconsin and Minnesota before it joins the Mississippi at Prescott. We are on the Minnesota side, roughly 2 miles north of downtown Stillwater, at a place everyone here simply calls the Boom Site. Just downstream, the river widens and deepens into Lake St. Croix, a natural riverine lake that stretches all the way to the Mississippi. The valley around us drains a watershed that once held some of the finest white pine forest on the continent. That combination of big timber upstream and slack water downstream is the whole reason this place mattered. The walk-in drops quickly off the bluff top, down toward the water on sandy paths and old stone steps. The soil here is loose and pale, because the whole bluff is soft sandstone barely holding itself together. You can hear the highway fade behind you and the river sounds take over. In late September, the maples along the slope are just starting to turn. It is hard to imagine that this peaceful descent once led down into a roaring industrial landscape of steam, shouting crews, and grinding timber. Stillwater calls itself the birthplace of Minnesota, and that claim is rooted in a real event. In August of 1848, delegates gathered at the corner of Myrtle and Main Streets in downtown Stillwater for a territorial convention. At that meeting they chose and agreed on the name Minnesota, drew up a petition asking Congress to create a territorial government, and sent Henry Hastings Sibley to Washington to deliver it. Minnesota became a territory the next year, in 1849, and a state in May of 1858. So before St. Paul was a capital, and before Minneapolis was a milling giant, the political story of Minnesota began in this little lumber town on the St. Croix. Down at water level, the river feels wide, slow, and calm, with the wooded bluffs of Wisconsin rising on the far shore. The shoreline is a mix of sand, springs seeping out of the rock, and cottonwoods leaning over the water. It is quiet enough now to hear individual birds. Every step of this beach was once decked with logs, tools, and the boots of working men. The river you are looking at was, for 2 generations, less a river than a conveyor belt. Here is what this place was. From 1856 to 1914, this bend in the river held the St. Croix Boom, the great collecting and sorting works for the entire St. Croix Valley logging industry. Every log cut on the upper river and its tributaries floated down with the spring drives and was stopped here, held behind chains of floating timbers called booms. Crews sorted the logs by their ownership marks and rafted them together for delivery to sawmills downstream. It was the earliest, the most important, and the longest-serving log storage and handling operation in Minnesota. As you walk north along the bank, you are moving through the footprint of the old boom works. Virtually nothing of the original structure survives above ground, which is remarkable for a site this important. No piers, no sheds, no mess hall, just the river doing what it did before the loggers came. The forest that was stripped from this valley has grown back in second and third growth. Nature has been quietly erasing the evidence for over a century. The boom began as an act of law before it was ever a structure in the water. In 1851, the Minnesota Territorial Legislature chartered the St. Croix Boom Company. The charter gave the company the right to catch every log coming down the river, sort the logs by their registered marks, and deliver them to their owners. In exchange, the company collected a toll of 40 cents for every 1,000 board feet that passed through. The first boom was built farther upstream, near Osceola and Taylor's Falls, where the company founders lived. Along this stretch, the trail squeezes between the water and walls of crumbling golden sandstone. Look closely, and you can see the layers, fine horizontal bands stacked like pages in a book. The rock is so soft you could scratch it with a fingernail, which is exactly why the river was able to carve this valley so deeply. Springs weep out of the base of the cliff and keep the sand dark and damp. These walls are the oldest thing in this story by a very wide margin. The original boom company struggled financially, and in 1856, a syndicate of Stillwater lumbermen bought the operation and moved it here, 2 miles above their own town. The new incorporators included Martin Mower, William Folsom, Christopher Carley, Samuel Berkelio, and a hard-driving Maine lumberman named Isaac Staples. Staples had come west from Maine, where the white pine was already running out, and he built himself into one of the great lumber barons of the St. Croix Valley. This site was a better choice than the old one, with islands to anchor the works and calm water for sorting. From that year on, Stillwater controlled the gateway through which the wealth of the entire valley had to pass. And then the bluff opens up, and there it is, a dark doorway in the sandstone just off the trail. The cave mouth sits near the old stone stairway, easy to miss until you are almost on top of it. Cold air drifts out of the opening even on a warm afternoon. The floor is soft, dry sand, and the walls are carved and scalloped by water that flowed through long ago. This is the Riverside cave that gives this hike its second act. The boom itself was brutally simple engineering. Crews sank rock-filled timber cribs and piers into the riverbed, then strung chains of floating logs between them, angled across the current. Logs drifting downstream were funneled by these floating barriers into narrow sorting channels along the shore. Men stood at the gaps reading the marks stamped on each passing log, steering each one with pike poles into the right holding pocket. When enough logs of one owner were gathered, crews pinned them into rafts for the tow downstream. Stepping inside, the temperature drops and the sound of the river disappears almost instantly. The passage runs back into the bluff roughly 75 feet, deep enough that the entrance shrinks to a bright keyhole behind you. The ceiling is low and smooth, and every surface is that same soft golden sand. Local accounts say the cave is natural in origin, but was enlarged during the logging era. People have been sheltering in this room, one way or another, for a very long time. The rock around you began as the floor of a shallow tropical sea. During the Cambrian period, roughly 500 million years ago, a warm inland ocean covered what is now Minnesota and Wisconsin. Wave after wave washed clean quartz sand across its floor, and over immense stretches of time, those sand beds were buried and pressed into sandstone. The sea also left behind layers of carbonate rock and the traces of some of the earliest complex animal life. When you press a hand against the cave wall, you are touching a beach that is 500 million years old. Deep in the chamber, the light turns dim and blue, and the carved walls take on strange shapes. Visitors have scratched names and dates into the soft stone, some of them generations old. The sand underfoot is completely dry, sheltered from every rain that has fallen since the river cut this bluff. It is a small cave, but it concentrates the geology of the whole valley into one room you can stand inside. Time feels very different in here than it does out on the trail. The valley outside was carved by water on a scale that is hard to picture today. At the end of the last ice age, meltwater from the retreating glaciers poured south, and for a time the St. Croix served as the outlet of glacial Lake Duluth, the ancestor of Lake Superior. That torrent was vastly larger than the modern river, and it sliced down through the soft Cambrian sandstone, cutting the deep valley and the bluffs we have been walking under. Upstream at Taylor's Falls, it even carved a rocky gorge through hard volcanic basalt. The wide, oversized valley holding this calm river is the signature of that ancient flood. Coming back out of the cave, the September light feels almost blinding. The trail continues along the shore, past seeps and springs and little sandy coves. Across the water, the Wisconsin side rises just as steep and just as green. It is easy to see why the wayside above draws photographers and painters in every season. But the river still has more history to give up, so we keep walking. Every log that came through this boom carried a brand, exactly like cattle on the open range. Logging companies stamped their symbol into the ends of their logs up in the winter cutting camps, and each mark was registered with the Surveyor General of Logs and Lumber. Over the 58 years the boom operated, more than 2,000 distinct marks were recorded on this river. The sorting crews had to read those marks at a glance on logs rolling and bobbing in cold, moving water. Getting it right mattered, because every log was money, and the mark was the only proof of who owned it. The islands and backwaters along this stretch are part of why the boom worked so well here. The channels between them made natural pens where sorted logs could wait without drifting away. Today, those same backwaters hold herons, turtles, and quiet water smooth enough to mirror the sky. Paddlers drift through where millions of dollars of white pine once waited for the mills. It is the same geography, just returned to its original business. Working the boom was among the most dangerous jobs in the whole logging economy. Boom men spent their days running across floating logs with pike poles and peavies, sorting timber in water that stayed cold well into summer. A slip meant going under between grinding logs, and drownings were a routine hazard of the trade. At the peak of the season, the company employed hundreds of men here, and a small working village grew up on this bank, with a boarding house, a mess hall, and company buildings. The skill those men had, reading moving timber and staying alive on top of it, has almost completely vanished from the world. From the shoreline here you get one of the finest views on the lower river. The water is broad and unhurried, sliding towards Stillwater and Lake St. Croix beyond. On a still afternoon, the bluffs double themselves perfectly in the surface. This is the calm that made the site useful, the same stillness that let crews hold and sort a winter worth of timber. The river that powered an industry now simply glows. Once sorted, the logs left here in enormous rafts. Crews chained and lashed the timber into floating fields that steamboats towed down Lake St. Croix and on down the Mississippi. Stillwater sawmills took a share, including the big mill Isaac Staples ran at the foot of town, while other rafts traveled to mill towns far downriver. Lumber from this valley framed houses, barns, and whole main streets across the treeless prairies to the west and south. When people say the white pine of the St. Croix built the Midwest, this is the doorway it all passed through. The sandy flat along the water here was a working landing for most of a lifetime. Supply boats tied up, raft crews staged their tows, and the shore rang with hammers and steam whistles. Now it is a beach where families wade in summer and photographers wait for the light. Driftwood collects where boom timbers once floated in their chain lines. Stand here long enough and the two pictures start to overlap. At the height of the operation, the scale of this place was almost absurd. In the biggest years, logs waiting to be sorted jammed the St. Croix for more than 9 miles upstream from where you are standing. The river simply disappeared under a floor of floating pine, so dense that people claimed you could cross from Minnesota to Wisconsin without touching water. Steamboat traffic upstream was blocked for weeks at a time, which caused constant legal battles with towns above the boom. All told, some 15.5 billion board feet of timber passed through this single bend in the river. Climbing away from the shore, the trail winds through oaks, maples, and pines that have reclaimed the old work grounds. In mid-September, the understory is full of asters and the first fallen leaves. Every tree here is a descendant of the forest that was cut, floated, and sold through this site. The valley that was stripped bare a century ago now reads as wild to anyone who does not know the story. Forests keep their history quietly. the early 20th century, the Great Pine Forest of the St. Croix watershed, some 8,500 square miles of it, had been cut through. The spring drives shrank year by year until there was nothing left worth sorting. On June 12, 1914, the St. Croix boom closed forever. Frank McGray, a longtime boom employee and former superintendent who had helped send the very first log through in 1856, came out of retirement to hitch the last log. One working lifetime, 58 years, was all it took to move an entire ancient forest through this bend in the river. When the boom closed, the buildings emptied, the piers rotted, and the river went quiet for the first time in 2 generations. Stillwater had to reinvent itself as its founding industry disappeared. The town turned its lumber money and its riverfront into the historic Main Street that draws visitors today. Up here, the shore returned to sand, springs, and birdsong. What you are walking through is not untouched nature, it is recovery. The site itself was nearly forgotten until the automobile age gave it a second life. In the 1930s, this stretch along Minnesota Highway 95 was developed as a roadside park, with stone steps and overlooks built down the bluff. Then in 1966, the St. Croix Boom Site was designated a National Historic Landmark, recognized for its national significance in the story of American industry. It is a rare kind of landmark, one where the historic structures are entirely gone and the land itself is the monument. A plaque, a stairway, and a quiet shoreline now carry the weight of the whole story. From the bluff top overlook, the whole scene comes together. The river bends silver below, the cave hides somewhere under your feet, and the valley rolls away green and gold towards Stillwater. It is one of the most photographed views in the St. Croix Valley, and it costs nothing but the walk. Highway travelers have been pulling over for this same view since the 1930s. Some places earn their pullouts. The river below you holds one more distinction. In 1968, the St. Croix and its tributary, the Namekagon, were protected among the original 8 rivers of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the founding class of that entire system. In 1972, Congress added the lower St. Croix, 52 miles from Taylor's Falls down to Prescott, and that is the water flowing past the boom site today. The whole corridor is now managed as the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway by the National Park Service. A river that was once buried under 9 miles of logs is now protected, end to end, for being wild. This short hike holds an entire American cycle in 1 mile of shoreline, a 500-million-year-old seabed, a valley cut by a glacial flood, a forest turned into 15 billion board feet of lumber, and a river given back its silence. The town it built downstream went on to birth a state. The cave in the bluff has outlasted every pier, every crew, and every fortune made here. Places like this reward anyone willing to walk down the stairs and look closely. The St. Croix Boom Site is an easy stop, just off Highway 95 2 miles north of Stillwater, with the cave, the springs, and the shoreline all a short walk from the parking area. Go in the fall if you can, when the valley turns gold and the crowds thin out. Stand on the beach, look 9 miles upstream, and try to picture the river solid with pine. Then step into the cave and put your hand on a beach 500 million years older than the loggers. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.